Her family abandoned her when she needed them most, turning their backs on an obese girl left to face pregnancy alone. In the darkest moment of her life, salvation came from an unexpected source, a mountain man who saw her humanity when others only saw her size. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The sun vanished behind the jagged peaks of the Stone Pine Valley, painting the sky in violent strokes of crimson and purple before surrendering to darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, as it always did in this remote corner of Brazil, sending villagers hurrying to the warmth of their homes. In São Pedro de Vale, windows glowed with lamplight, doors closed firmly against the night, all except one. Inside a modest stone house at the edge of the village, 15-year-old Mara Silva sat rigid on a wooden chair, her swollen belly protruding beneath her worn dress. Her parents paced before her, their whispers growing louder with each passing minute, faces contorted with shame and fear. "What will people say?" her mother hissed, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. The daughter of Antonio and Lucia Silva, pregnant at 15, will be ruined. Mara's father slammed his fist against the table, making the clay cups jump. "Who is the father? Tell us!" When Mara remained silent, tears streaming down her round cheeks, his voice dropped to something colder than the mountain air. "Then you leave us no choice." The teenager reached for her mother's hand. "Please," she begged, "I have nowhere to go." Her plea met stone faces. Within minutes they had stuffed her few belongings into a cloth sack, thrust her thin shawl into her trembling hands, and pushed her through the door. The lock clicked behind her with terrible finality. Standing alone in the gathering darkness, Mara wrapped the inadequate shawl around her shoulders. The weight of her unborn child seemed to pull her toward the earth as she stumbled away from the only home she had ever known. The village square loomed ahead, where a few locals still lingered despite the cold. Mara kept her head down, but couldn't escape their stares. Old Senora Ferreira crossed herself and turned away. Two men outside the village store fell silent as she passed, then erupted in snickers behind her back. "Shame walks on two legs," someone muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Each step grew heavier than the last as Mara trudged toward the outskirts of São Pedro de Vale. The biting wind cut through her shawl, but the villagers' contempt cut deeper. Night had fully descended now, and the distant howl of wild dogs echoed from the mountains. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Mara followed the dirt path, leading away from the village, each painful step carrying her deeper into the wilderness. The lights of São Pedro grew dimmer behind her, until only darkness remained, broken occasionally by the cold, indifferent light of stars above the Stone Pine Valley. The darkness fell quickly over the mountains, bringing with it a bitter cold that cut through Mara Silva's thin clothing. Her swollen legs finally surrendered near a frozen stream, the icy water gurgling mockingly as she collapsed onto the frost-hardened ground. The 15-year-old girl curled around her pregnant belly, trying to shield both herself and her unborn child from the merciless night. Hours had passed since she'd last eaten. The hunger gnawed at her insides, competing with exhaustion for which would claim her first. Mara's breathing formed small clouds in the frigid air as she stared up at the stars, wondering if they would be the last sight her eyes would ever behold. In the distance, wild dogs howled, a sound that once frightened her from the safety of her family's home, but now seemed almost fitting company for her final moments. "At least someone will notice when I'm gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of wind through bare branches. The young girl closed her eyes, tears freezing against her cheeks. Would anyone in São Pedro do Vale even wonder what had become of her? Or would they simply nod with satisfaction that the problem had disappeared? Her hand rested protectively over her rounded middle, the only warmth she could still feel. Unknown to Mara, someone was indeed watching. From the shadows of the towering pines, João Costa observed the fallen girl with eyes that had witnessed their own share of suffering. The mountain man, as villagers called him, stood motionless, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the night sky. The wind carried her soft sobs to him, each one striking something deep within his chest. João had come to these woods years ago, fleeing his own demons. He understood what it meant to be cast aside, to be deemed unworthy. The survivalist recognized the look of someone who had been judged and discarded. He had seen it in his own reflection too many times. Her whimpers grew fainter as the temperature dropped further. The man stepped forward, dried pine needles crunching beneath his weathered boots. Something in his heart, a part he thought had hardened long ago, refused to let this young life fade away into the indifferent night. The moonlight revealed more of her condition, a child herself, carrying another, abandoned to the wilderness. João's jaw tightened. He had turned his back on the cruelty of village life, but he would not turn away from this. His calloused hands flexed at his sides as he made his decision. Mountain Man moved toward Mara with quiet determination. The wild dogs might be calling, but they would not claim this girl tonight. Not while he still drew breath in these mountains. Without saying a word, João Costa lifted Mara into his arms, her trembling body immediately responding to his warmth. She felt the strength in his broad shoulders as he carried her with surprising gentleness, her weight seemingly nothing to the mountain man. The cold that had seeped into her bones began to retreat, replaced by the first hint of safety she'd felt since being cast out. The forest path twisted through tangled underbrush, branches catching at her thin shawl as they passed. Mara's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, caught glimpses of the night sky between the trees. The howling of wild dogs seemed more distant now, less threatening with each step João took. "Almost there," he murmured, his deep voice barely audible above the wind. These were the first words he'd spoken, and Mara clutched them like a promise. They emerged at the edge of a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood sentinel against the darkness. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, dancing upward into the star-filled sky. João pushed the wooden door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the girl in his arms. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with golden light and blessed warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows across walls lined with shelves of jars and tools. The scent of wood smoke mingled with something else, a rich, earthy aroma that made Mara's empty stomach clench painfully. The survivalist gently lowered her onto a simple bed covered with thick woolen blankets near the fire. He moved with practiced efficiency, adding another log to the flames before crossing to a pot hanging over a smaller cooking fire. Steam rose as he stirred the contents, a thick stew that had been simmering for hours. "You need to eat," he said, his voice soft but firm as he filled a wooden bowl. The simplicity of his care brought unexpected tears to Mara's eyes. The stew was simple, beans, root vegetables, and herbs, but to the starving girl, it tasted like salvation. Each spoonful brought strength back to her limbs and clarity to her mind. João sat quietly nearby, not pressing for her story, respecting the fragile silence between them. For the first time in weeks, Mara closed her eyes without fear of what morning might bring. The cabin's rough-hewn walls stood between her and the judgment of São Pedro do Vale. Here, in this unexpected sanctuary, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and chosen not to look away. As sleep finally claimed her, Mara's hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. Perhaps tomorrow would bring more pain, more challenges, but tonight, against all odds, she had found shelter in the wilderness. Morning light filtered through the rough-hewn windows of João Costa's cabin, casting golden beams across the worn wooden floor. Mara Silva stirred beneath a thick woolen blanket, momentarily disoriented until memories of the previous night flooded back. The bitter cold, her desperate wandering, and the silent mountain man who had carried her to safety. The cabin's interior revealed itself in the gentle light. Simple shelves lined the walls, stocked with glass jars of dried beans, preserved fruits, and amber honey, a humble treasury against winter's scarcity. The air carried the comforting scent of wood smoke and something savory simmering over the hearth. Joao moved with surprising grace for such a broad-shouldered man, his footsteps barely audible as he tended the morning fire. He acknowledged her wakefulness with a slight nod, his weathered face neither pitying nor judgmental, a welcome change from the scornful glares she'd endured in São Pedro de Valle. "You need to eat," he said, his voice low and steady as he ladled steaming broth into a wooden bowl. "For both of you." Mara's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly as she accepted the offering. The warm bowl felt like a miracle against her palms after the previous night's desolation. After she'd eaten, Joao gestured toward the cabin door. "Come, there's something you should see." Outside, tucked against the southern wall of the cabin, stood a small structure of wood and glass, a winter garden, its transparent panels capturing precious sunlight. Inside, defying the mountain frost, grew patches of hardy greens and herbs. "The sun warms it during the day," Joao explained, demonstrating how to lift one of the panels. "The earth holds the heat at night." Together they harvested tender leaves of kale and wild sorrel, Mara's fingers working alongside his. She noticed calluses on his hands, evidence of a life built through persistent labor rather than easy fortune. Back inside, Joao taught her to prepare a nourishing soup, adding the fresh greens to a base of beans and preserved vegetables. The simple act of creating sustenance soothed something in Mara's wounded spirit. As she ate her second meal beneath his roof, Mara studied her unlikely savior. Joao Costa was nothing like the villagers who had cast her out. There was no disgust in his eyes when he looked at her pregnant form. No whispered judgments about her size or circumstances. "Why did you help me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joao considered her question, his gaze drifting to the window. "These mountains don't care who you were, only who you choose to become." For the first time in months, hope flickered inside Mara, fragile but persistent. Perhaps there was a reason she had survived the night after all. Perhaps, like the winter greens thriving against impossible odds, she too might find a way to grow beyond the harsh judgment that had nearly destroyed her. As the pale winter sun crept higher each day, Joao Costa established a gentle routine. Every morning, he would wake Mara Silva before dawn, his voice soft but insistent. "The forest speaks clearest in the early hours," he would say, helping her bundle her swollen form against the mountain chill. The mountain man proved to be a patient teacher. He showed Mara how to distinguish the warning calls of jays from the peaceful songs of thrushes. "Listen," he would whisper, his calloused hand on her shoulder. "That sharp cry means a hawk is hunting. The animals are warning each other." Mara absorbed everything with desperate attention. She learned to identify edible roots by their leaves, to spot the subtle differences between healing herbs and their poisonous lookalikes. Joao taught her to crush certain leaves into poultices for her swollen ankles and aching back, remedies passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. "Your body is working hard," he told her one afternoon, as she winced while gathering kindling. "There's no shame in pain, only in ignoring what it's telling you." Those words struck Mara deeply. In the village, her discomfort had been something to hide, her pregnancy a mark of disgrace. Here, in the wilderness of Stone Pine Valley, her body's changes were treated as natural, even worthy of care and attention. Each new skill became a small victory. When she successfully identified all the safe mushrooms in Joao's collection, pride bloomed in her chest. When she managed to start a fire using only bark and friction, tears of accomplishment welled in her eyes. "I never thought I could do any of this," she confessed one evening as they sat by the hearth, the cabin warm against the howling wind outside. Joao nodded, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "People can survive more than they believe possible," he said. "The trick is to keep moving forward, even when the path seems impossible." At night, wrapped in borrowed blankets, Mara would place her hands on her growing belly and whisper stories of what she'd learned that day. The shame that had followed her from São Pedro de Valle began to recede, replaced by a cautious hope. The mountains were unforgiving. Bitter cold snaps, sudden storms, the distant howls of predators. But they offered something her former home had not: the chance to define herself by her strength rather than her mistakes. "Tomorrow," João promised, as they finished their simple meal of root vegetables and dried meat, "I'll show you how to read the sky for weather." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "The clouds have stories to tell, if you know how to listen." The afternoon sun filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Mara Silva had spent the morning learning how to identify edible mushrooms, and her fingers still smelled of earth and pine. As João Costa stepped outside to check his traps, she found herself alone in the cabin, her curiosity drawing her to corners she hadn't yet explored. Behind João's sturdy work table, partially hidden by a stack of dried herbs, sat an old wooden chest. Its brass hinges were tarnished with age, but the lock had been left open. Mara hesitated, her hand hovering over the lid. This was the man who had saved her life, offered her shelter when her own family had cast her out. Did she have the right to pry into his secrets? Her fingers traced the worn edges of the chest, before gently lifting the lid. Inside, nestled among a few weathered tools and faded photographs, lay a leather-bound journal. The binding was cracked from use, the pages yellowed and dog-eared. When she carefully opened it, Mara discovered neat, deliberate handwriting filling page after page. "I buried my mother today," began the first entry. "Father has been gone 3 years now. I am 12 and alone." Mara's breath caught in her throat. She read on, learning how young João had survived after being orphaned, how he'd slept in barns and begged for work, how villagers had driven him away with suspicion and fear. The mountain man had once been a frightened boy, fighting hunger and loneliness in the same wilderness that now sustained him. "The forest does not judge," one passage read. "It simply asks that you learn its ways." People see weakness and exploit it. Nature sees weakness and offers a choice: adapt or perish. Tears blurred Mara's vision as she turned the pages. The journal chronicled João's gradual transformation from desperate orphan to self-sufficient woodsman. His early entries were filled with despair, but slowly gave way to determination, then quiet pride in his growing skills. When she heard footsteps approaching, Mara quickly returned the journal to its place. João entered, carrying freshly caught fish, and noticed her reddened eyes. "You found my story," he said simply, without anger. Mara nodded. "I thought you were always strong," she whispered. The tall man set down his catch and sat beside her, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Strength isn't being unbreakable," he told her. "It's being broken and continuing anyway." In that moment, Mara understood something profound about her mentor and herself. The power she saw in João wasn't born from never experiencing pain. It had been forged through it. Perhaps her own struggles weren't weaknesses to be ashamed of, but the very forge that would strengthen her for whatever lay ahead. The first sign of spring arrived with the morning dew, a faint cry echoing through the awakening forest. Mara Silva paused while gathering kindling, her swollen belly making the task more challenging each day. The sound came again, weak and frightened. Following the noise, she discovered a young fawn tangled in a thicket of thorns. Its delicate legs were scratched and bleeding, brown eyes wide with terror as it struggled against the sharp branches. Mara remembered João's patient instructions about approaching wild animals: move slowly, speak softly, establish trust. "It's okay," she whispered, keeping her voice steady. "I won't hurt you." The pregnant teen knelt carefully, her movements deliberate, as she extended her hand. The fawn trembled but stopped struggling, perhaps too exhausted to fight. With gentle fingers, Mara began freeing the animal's legs one by one, carefully unwinding thorny vines that had trapped the creature. "Juan taught me about these plants," she murmured, working methodically. "The thorns look dangerous, but they're not poisonous." Blood stained her hands as she worked, but Mara didn't flinch. The mountain man had shown her how to face discomfort without fear, a lesson that served her well now. When the last thorn was removed, she tore a strip from her shawl, once her only protection against the cold, and wrapped the fawn's worst wounds. The small creature collapsed into her lap, its breathing rapid but steady. Mara stroked its spotted back, marveling at how something so fragile could survive in this harsh wilderness. She felt a flutter in her abdomen, her own child responding to the moment. "You're like me," she told the fawn, a smile warming her face. "Lost and hurt, but still fighting." For nearly an hour, Mara sat with the animal, giving it time to regain strength. When it finally stood on wobbly legs, she watched with pride as it took tentative steps before darting back toward the forest depths. That evening, as she described the encounter to Joao, his weathered face creased with approval. "You saved a life today," he said simply. The words settled deep within her. Just months ago, she had been discarded by her family in São Pedro de Valle, deemed worthless and shameful. Now her hands had power. They could heal, protect, and nurture. Mara placed those same hands on her growing belly, feeling the life within her stir. For the first time since being cast out, she truly believed she could be a mother to this child. If she could save a wild creature with patience and care, perhaps she could raise a daughter or son with the same gentle strength. The wilderness, once her punishment, had become her teacher, and Mara was finally ready to learn its most important lesson: how to give life rather than merely survive. Time moved differently in the forest. As the seasons shifted, Mara Silva's body changed with them, her belly growing rounder as the child within her developed. The morning sickness that had once plagued her gave way to a surprising energy that matched the spring's renewal. Joao noticed the change in her eyes, a quiet determination replacing the fear that had haunted her since arriving at his doorstep. "Today we build," Joao announced one morning, gesturing toward a small clearing near a cluster of pine trees. He demonstrated how to select the right branches, showing Mara how to test each one for strength and flexibility. Together they constructed a simple lean-to shelter, his calloused hands guiding her smaller ones as she learned to secure the structure against mountain winds. "What if I need to move? To find somewhere new?" Mara asked, thinking about the uncertain future ahead. The mountain man smiled. "Then you'll know how to create safety wherever you go." Their days fell into a rhythm of practical lessons. Joao taught her to fashion snares from twine and branches, explaining how to identify animal trails and set traps that would provide food without cruelty. Mara absorbed each instruction with growing confidence, her hands becoming steadier with every attempt. In the evenings, they sat by the fire as Joao demonstrated how to mend torn clothing. Mara's fingers, once clumsy with the needle, grew nimble as she repaired a tear in her shawl. The simple act of restoration gave her a strange satisfaction, a torn thing made whole again through patience and care. "I was useless before," she confessed one night, her hands resting on her swollen abdomen. "At home, I was just another mouth to feed." Joao looked up from the trap he was repairing. "No one is useless," he said firmly. "Some just haven't found their strength yet." Each morning, Mara woke earlier, eager to practice what she had learned. She began to identify edible plants without Joao's guidance, bringing back handfuls of wild berries and herbs that complemented their meals. The wilderness, which had once seemed a punishment, transformed into a classroom filled with lessons of survival and independence. As weeks passed, Mara realized she no longer thought of herself as the girl who had been cast out. Instead, she was becoming someone new, an apprentice of the forest, a student of resilience. Her body, carrying both her past and her future, moved with growing purpose through the trees. "I'm not afraid anymore," she told Joao one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley in gold. He nodded, understanding the magnitude of her transformation. "That," he said quietly, "is the most important skill I could ever teach you." The frost-kissed morning was still young when Mara heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the forest floor. She paused from hanging freshly washed clothes outside Joao's cabin, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate rather than cautious. Mara's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, a protective gesture that had become second nature. From between the pine trees emerged Paula Oliveira, her familiar face a sudden, jarring reminder of the life Mara had been forced to leave behind. The woman's eyes narrowed when she spotted Mara standing beside the cabin, and then widened slightly at the sight of Joao Costa emerging from around the corner, arms full of firewood. "So this is where you've been hiding," Paula said, her voice carrying across the clearing, "living with the mountain hermit while your poor parents suffer the shame you brought them." Mara felt the old familiar heat of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, but something was different now. The shame didn't consume her as it once had. Instead, she straightened her back and met Paula's gaze directly. "I'm not hiding," Mara replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm surviving. Something I wouldn't have managed if I'd stayed in the village." Paula scoffed, gesturing dismissively at Mara's pregnant form. "And what kind of life is this, living like animals in the wilderness?" Joao set down his firewood quietly, his presence reassuring but unimposing. He didn't speak. This was Mara's battle to fight, and they both knew it. "We have food, shelter, and kindness here," Mara said, taking a step forward. "More than I found in São Pedro de Valle. This child deserves a chance at life without judgment, and so do I." The young woman's newfound confidence seemed to catch Paula off guard. The villager opened her mouth, then closed it again, her prepared insults suddenly inadequate in the face of Mara's calm dignity. "The village has rules for a reason," Paula finally managed, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "And I have reasons to live," Mara countered, placing both hands on her belly now. "I won't apologize for that anymore." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft whisper of wind through the pines. Paula's eyes darted between Mara and Joao, then to the modest but well-kept cabin behind them. Whatever she had expected to find, perhaps a cowering, regretful girl, was clearly not what stood before her now. "Your mother asks about you," Paula finally said, her tone softer, almost reluctant. "Not openly, but she does." Mara nodded, absorbing this small piece of her former life without letting it shake her resolve. "Tell her I'm alive. That's all she needs to know for now." Paula Oliveira's face contorted, her prepared insults dying on her lips as Mara Silva stood unwavering before her. The transformation in the pregnant teenager was unmistakable. Gone was the cowering girl who had been chased from the village with shame as her only companion. In her place stood someone altogether different, someone whose eyes reflected the wisdom of the wilderness. "You think you're better than us now?" Paula finally managed, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "Living out here like some kind of—" She gestured vaguely at the cabin and surrounding forest, searching for words that wouldn't come. Mara didn't rush to fill the silence. She had learned from Joao that patience was its own form of strength. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, neither apologetic nor angry. "I'm just trying to survive, Paula, the same as anyone." Joao Costa moved quietly to Mara's side. His tall figure a reassuring presence, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the simple gesture conveying more support than any grand declaration could have. "The strongest voice," he murmured, just loud enough for Mara to hear, "is the one that doesn't need to shout to be heard." Paula shifted uncomfortably, suddenly conscious of how small her accusations seemed against the backdrop of the vast forest. The villager glanced between them, noting the quiet dignity in Mara's stance and the protective calm in the mountain man's eyes. "The village talks about you," Paula said, her tone now uncertain. "They say you've bewitched him." She nodded toward Joao. Mara almost laughed. The idea that she, a cast-out, pregnant teenager, could bewitch anyone seemed absurd now. What she and Joao had built was something far more valuable than the gossip of São Pedro de Vale could comprehend. "You can tell them whatever you want," Mara replied. "It doesn't change what's true." Something in Paula's expression shifted. Perhaps recognition, perhaps respect. Without another word, she turned and disappeared back into the trees, the sound of her footsteps fading quickly. As silence returned to the clearing, Mara felt a strange lightness in her chest. The encounter that would have once destroyed her had instead revealed how far she had come. The judgment from her old life, once so crushing, now seemed distant and powerless. "You stood your ground," Joao observed quietly. Mara nodded, one hand instinctively moving to rest on her growing belly. "I didn't feel afraid." "That's how you know you're healing," he said, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. That night, as Mara prepared their evening meal, she realized she had won something precious, not just survival, but the freedom to define herself on her own terms. Mara Silva ventured deeper into the forest that afternoon, her growing confidence evident in each step. The pregnancy had changed her body, making movement more deliberate, but she'd adapted to the terrain over the past months. Joao had taught her to recognize safe paths and identify landmarks, skills that now allowed her to explore independently. The sound of rushing water drew her attention. Following it through a tangle of underbrush, she discovered a hidden stream cutting through moss-covered rocks. Crystal-clear water danced over smooth stones, and beneath the surface, silvery fish darted in graceful patterns. Her stomach growled loudly at the sight, a reminder that her body now nourished two lives. "Fish," she whispered, watching their movements with newfound interest. Joao had shown her how to find food in the wilderness, but she'd never attempted fishing on her own. A memory surfaced, the mountain man demonstrating how indigenous people created traps from natural materials. Could she replicate that? Determination set in as Mara gathered flexible branches from nearby saplings. Her fingers, once soft from village life, had grown calloused and strong. She wove the branches together, creating a funnel-like structure. Using tall grass, she secured the frame, periodically testing its strength. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy as she worked, casting dappled light across her hands. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. The baby kicked, as if encouraging her efforts, and Mara smiled, placing a hand on her rounded belly. "We'll eat well tonight," she promised softly. Positioning the trap required patience. Mara waded into the shallow edges of the stream, her feet numbing in the cold water as she wedged the contraption between rocks. The design was simple but effective. Fish could swim in but would struggle to find their way out. She retreated to a nearby log to wait, humming quietly to herself. An hour passed before curiosity pulled her back to the water. When she lifted the trap, 3 medium-sized fish thrashed inside. The sight brought tears to their eyes, not from sentimentality, but from pride. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Mara wrapped her catch in the edge of her shawl and started back toward the cabin. The journey seemed shorter, buoyed by her success. She imagined Joao's reaction, not just approval, but respect for her ingenuity. The warm glow of the cabin appeared through the trees as twilight settled over Stone Pine Valley. Mara quickened her pace, eager to share her triumph. Tonight's meal would taste different. It would be the first feast she had provided entirely through her own skills. For a girl who had once been cast out with nothing, This simple achievement felt monumental. Each fish represented not just sustenance, but freedom. The growing certainty that she could survive, even thrive on her own terms. The afternoon shadows stretched across the wooden floor as Mara rummaged through a corner of Joao's cabin she hadn't fully explored. Her fingers brushed against something solid, another chest, smaller than the one containing Joao Costa's journal, tucked beneath a pile of worn blankets. Curiosity piqued, she carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled among faded fabrics and dried lavender sprigs, lay a bundle of letters tied with fraying twine. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the handwriting on the topmost envelope, her mother's distinctive script, the letters slightly tilted to the right. How had these found their way here? Had Joao been in contact with her family? With trembling hands, she untied the bundle. The paper felt delicate between her fingers, the edges softened by time and handling. Tear stains had blurred some of the ink, making certain words swim before her eyes as she began to read. "My dearest Mara," the first letter began, "I pray daily that this reaches you, that you are alive, that someone kinder than us has shown you mercy." Letter after letter revealed a side of her parents she'd never known. Her mother's own teenage pregnancy, the shame her grandparents had heaped upon her, and how that cycle of judgment had poisoned their hearts. Her father's struggles with alcoholism after losing his job at the lumber mill. The pressure from elder Roberto Santos and others in São Pedro do Vale to maintain standards by casting out their pregnant daughter. "We were cowards," one letter confessed. "We chose the approval of others over the love of our child." Mara leaned against the rough-hewn wall, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The baby kicked, as if responding to her tumultuous emotions. These revelations didn't erase the bitter cold of that night, the door slamming in her face, or the long hours she'd spent believing she would die alone in the wilderness. Yet something shifted within her. The white-hot anger that had kept her warm during those first terrible nights began to cool. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because carrying that rage exhausted her. When Joao returned from checking his traps, he found Mara sitting quietly by the window, the letters neatly stacked beside her. "They've been sending these to the trading post," he explained softly. "I wasn't sure when to give them to you." Mara nodded, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Their pain doesn't excuse what they did," she said finally. "But I don't want to become what they were, afraid and cruel." The mountain man smiled gently, understanding in his eyes. "That's why you'll be a better parent than they could ever be." The whispers began with the traveling merchants who passed through Stone Pine Valley. They'd seen her, the girl everyone thought would perish in the wilderness. Mara Silva was not only alive, but thriving alongside the reclusive mountain man. The traders stopping for supplies in São Pedro do Vale shared tales of the pregnant teenager who now moved through the forest with surprising confidence, her knowledge of wild plants impressive, even to seasoned outdoorsmen. In the village square, these stories spread like wildfire. Families who had once crossed the street to avoid Mara's shame now leaned in eagerly to catch every detail. The butcher's wife claimed her cousin had seen Mara gathering berries, her pregnancy advanced, but her steps sure. The local seamstress, who had refused to serve the girl months earlier, now wondered aloud if Mara might know remedies for her persistent cough. "They say Joao Costa taught her to survive," whispered Antonio, the village baker, as he handed warm bread to a customer. "The same man we all feared as children is protecting her when we cast her out." The irony wasn't lost on the villagers. For years, parents had frightened misbehaving children with tales of the mountain man who snatched disobedient youngsters. Now, this same feared figure had become a guardian to the girl they'd abandoned. Some of the older women gathered at the well, their voices hushed yet urgent. "Perhaps we were too harsh," admitted one, glancing nervously at the mountains rising beyond the village. Another nodded, remembering how she'd turned away when Mara had begged for shelter that terrible night. Even Pastor Rodriguez, who had spoken most vehemently against the girl's sinful condition, grew quiet when Mara's name arose during conversations. The certainty of his moral judgment seemed less absolute with each new report of her resilience. Children began creating games inspired by the tale, pretending to be Mara surviving in the wilderness or Joao teaching forest secrets. Parents who once forbade mention of the girl now found themselves unable to stem the tide of fascination. Paula Oliveira, who had confronted Mara in the forest, returned to the village with stories that only enhanced the growing legend. Her eyes are different now, Paula told anyone who would listen. She stands tall. She isn't afraid anymore. As autumn painted the valley in gold and crimson, the cabin in the woods took on an almost mythical quality in village conversations. Some claimed it glowed with warmth on the coldest nights. Others insisted they'd heard singing carried on the wind. Perhaps, suggested the elderly Dona Teresa, stirring her tea thoughtfully, that cabin isn't just a place of survival. Perhaps it's where miracles happen. The tranquility Mara Silva had found in the mountains proved fragile as her pregnancy entered its final months. One evening, as Joao Costa prepared a simple stew over the cabin's fire, Mara suddenly doubled over, her face contorted in pain. A burning fever quickly followed, leaving her shivering despite the warmth of the hearth. "Something's wrong," she whispered, clutching her swollen belly with trembling hands. The mountain man's usually calm demeanor shifted to quiet urgency. He helped Mara to the small bed in the corner, his weathered hands gentle as he placed damp cloths on her forehead. Throughout the night, her condition worsened. Her breathing became shallow and labored, each gasp more frightening than the last. Joao never left her side. By candlelight, he crushed dried herbs from his carefully stored collection, brewing teas of willow bark and chamomile. When Mara couldn't keep the bitter liquid down, he mixed poultices of crushed leaves and spread them across her feverish skin. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You're stronger than this." For 3 days, the cabin became a battleground against an invisible enemy. The man who had survived alone for years now found himself terrified at the prospect of losing the young woman who had brought unexpected purpose to his solitary existence. He bathed her burning skin with cool water from the stream, supporting her through violent chills that made her teeth chatter. During brief moments of clarity, Mara would find Joao still there, his large frame hunched in concentration as he prepared another remedy. Sometimes he would tell her stories of his own struggles, his voice a lifeline pulling her back from the brink. "My mother taught me these cures before she passed," he explained, pressing a compress of crushed pine needles and honey to her chest. "She said healing comes from both the plants and the intention behind them." On the 4th night, when Mara's fever finally broke, she awoke to find him asleep in the chair beside her, his hand still holding hers. The realization struck her with unexpected force. This man who owed her nothing had fought for her life as if it were his own. "We made it," she whispered when his eyes fluttered open. Joao's weathered face softened with relief. "We did." In those desperate hours between life and death, Mara understood something profound about family. It wasn't just blood or obligation that made people care for one another. Sometimes family was found in the most unexpected places, created through choice and commitment rather than birth. The mountain man had become more family to her than those who had cast her out, proving that the strongest bonds were those freely given. The first frost of autumn painted the cabin windows with delicate patterns, as Mara wrapped herself in a thick woolen blanket. Her pregnancy had advanced considerably, her movements more deliberate now as she tended the hearth fire. The peaceful morning routine was interrupted by the sound of multiple footsteps crunching through fallen leaves outside. João Costa tensed as he moved to the window. "We have visitors," he said quietly, his broad shoulders squaring as he recognized the approaching group. 5 figures emerged from the forest path. A delegation from São Pedro do Vale, led by Elder Roberto Santos, his gray beard and stern expression marking him as the village's moral authority. Behind him trailed 4 other villagers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Stay inside if you wish," João offered, but Mara shook her head. "This is my fight too," she replied, straightening her back despite the weight she carried. Elder Roberto's voice boomed across the clearing before they even reached the door. "We've come for Mara Silva," he announced, as if reclaiming lost property. Joel opened the door, but stood firmly in the threshold. The mountain man's presence alone made 2 of the villagers step back. "The girl has been away long enough," Elder Roberto continued, his weathered face creasing with practiced concern. "The village council has agreed it's time to restore proper order. Her parents are prepared to forgive her, in discretion." Mara moved beside Joel, one hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. The same people who had watched her family cast her out now spoke of forgiveness as if it were theirs to give. "You speak of order," Mara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But what order abandoned a pregnant girl to die in the mountains?" Elder Roberto's expression hardened. "You were always headstrong, child. This stubbornness is precisely why." "My name is Mara," she interrupted, "not child or girl, and I'm not returning to be hidden away as the village's shame." The elder stepped forward, but Joao's presence made him reconsider. "Your family made their choice months ago," Mara finished. "I've made mine now." One of the women in the delegation whispered something about the mountain man's influence, but Mara shook her head. "Joao taught me to survive, but this decision is mine alone." She looked directly at each visitor. "I won't trade this freedom for your conditional acceptance." The silence that followed hung heavy in the crisp autumn air. Elder Roberto's authority seemed to diminish with each passing moment as Mara stood her ground, her eyes clear and unwavering. "Then you choose exile," he finally pronounced. Mara's hand found Joao, drawing strength from his steady presence. "No," she replied. "I choose myself." The elders retreated down the narrow forest path, their hunched shoulders betraying their defeat. Elder Roberto Santos cast one final glance back at the cabin, his weathered face a mask of confusion. The authority that had served him for decades in São Pedro do Vale suddenly seemed meaningless against the quiet strength of a girl they had discarded. Mara Silva stood in the doorway, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. The autumn breeze lifted her hair as golden leaves swirled around her feet in a gentle dance. She watched until the last figure disappeared among the trees, feeling neither triumph nor anger, only a profound sense of peace washing over her. "They expected me to bow my head and follow," she whispered, more to herself than to João. "Just like I always did before." João Costa moved beside her, his tall frame casting a protective shadow. The mountain man's eyes crinkled at the corners as he gazed at his young apprentice with unmistakable pride. "You found your voice," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "You chose your own path. No one can take that from you now." Mara stepped out onto the small porch, breathing deeply of the crisp mountain air. 6 months ago, she had stumbled through these woods half dead, shamed and abandoned. Now she stood tall, her body stronger, her spirit unbroken. The cabin that had once been merely shelter had become something more, a home built on chosen bonds rather than obligation. "I used to dream about them coming for me," she admitted, watching a pair of birds chase each other through the canopy. "I thought I wanted their forgiveness." João nodded, understanding in his silence. He had read the same longing in his own journal entries years ago, after being orphaned and cast aside. But when I saw their faces, I realized something. Mara continued, her voice growing steadier. I don't need their approval to be whole. The survivalist placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the same hand that had taught her to fish, to build, to heal. That's the hardest lesson the wilderness teaches, he said. And the most valuable. Inside the cabin, a pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the air with the scent of herbs Mara had gathered herself. She had prepared it that morning, anticipating the confrontation, determined to have something warm waiting regardless of the outcome. What happens now? She asked, turning toward her mentor. João smiled, gesturing toward the horizon, where the mountains stood eternal against the sky. Whatever you choose, he answered simply. Your story belongs to you now. For the first time since being cast out, Mara felt truly free. Word of Mara Silva's courageous stand against Elder Roberto Santos spread like wildfire through the valley and beyond. Within weeks, young women from villages as far as 3 days' journey away began appearing at the edge of the forest, their eyes scanning the trees for the cabin they'd heard so much about. The first to arrive was Elena, a 16-year-old cast out for refusing an arranged marriage. She stumbled upon the cabin at dusk, her face gaunt from days of minimal food. Mara welcomed her without hesitation, recognizing the same hollow look she once carried. I heard you stood up to them, Elena whispered as she warmed her hands by the fire. They say you found strength in these mountains. João Costa nodded silently from his workbench. His broad shoulders relaxed as he continued carving a wooden spoon. The mountain man had grown accustomed to these visitors, understanding that his home had become something more than just shelter. Soon others followed. Beatriz with bruises she wouldn't explain, Camila, who'd been blamed for her family's misfortunes, and Luisa, who simply couldn't bear the weight of secrets anymore. Each arrived with nothing but desperation and the whispered legend of a pregnant girl who had survived abandonment. Mara taught them what João had taught her, how to identify edible plants, build simple traps for small game, and weave baskets from reeds by the stream. But more importantly, she showed them how to stand tall again, to look at their reflections in the water without shame. Your worth isn't measured by their judgment, she told a group gathered around the hearth one evening, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The wilderness taught me that broken things can still be strong. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, transformed into a small community. The girls constructed additional shelters nearby using techniques João demonstrated, simple structures of wood and stone that offered protection from the elements and predators alike. Some villagers from São Pedro de Valle watched this growing settlement with suspicion. Paula Oliveira, who had once confronted Mara with such venom, now observed from a distance, her expression unreadable as she watched the young women move confidently through the forest. João expanded his garden to accommodate the newcomers, teaching them to nurture the soil that would sustain them through winter. His quiet presence provided security, but it was Mara's resilience that truly inspired them. We're not outcasts anymore, Mara told a tearful girl one night. We're survivors building something new. As autumn painted the forest in amber and gold, the cabin that had once sheltered a single frightened girl became a beacon of hope, a place where shame transformed into strength, and where those rejected by society found family in each other's courage. The first snow of winter blanketed the Stone Pine Valley in pristine white, transforming João Costa's cabin into a haven of warmth against the encroaching cold. Mara Silva stood by the window, her palm resting on her swollen belly as she felt her child stir within, each movement a reminder of the precious life she had fought so desperately to protect. She's restless today, Mara whispered to João, who was stoking the hearth fire. The mountain man nodded with a gentle smile, his broad shoulders relaxed as he arranged the logs to burn through the night. Outside, the garden beds lay dormant under protective coverings of pine branches and straw. Mara's handiwork. She had learned to prepare for winter from her mentor, understanding that survival meant thinking seasons ahead. What had once been Joao's solitary garden now yielded enough to support the 3 young women who had found refuge in the expanding cabin. In the main room, Luisa and Camila, girls from neighboring villages who had arrived with their own stories of rejection, sat mending torn clothing. Mara had taught them the precise stitching techniques Joao had once shown her, passing on knowledge like a treasured inheritance. "The needle needs to follow the original seam," she instructed, her fingers guiding Camila's inexperienced hands. "That way, the fabric holds together even when stretched." As evening descended, they gathered around the hearth where Mara told stories, not just of survival, but of dignity reclaimed. Her voice, once timid in the face of village scorn, now resonated with quiet authority. She spoke of finding strength in the wilderness, of learning that true family could be chosen, and that shame was a burden one could set down and walk away from. "Before I came here," she told them, "I believed what others said about me. Now, I know better." Each morning, despite the growing discomfort of late pregnancy, Mara rose before dawn. She would stand at the cabin door, watching the sun paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. In these quiet moments, gratitude washed over her, for Joao's kindness, for her own resilience, for the community they were building in defiance of those who had cast them out. "They tried to write my ending," she confided to Joao one morning, as they shared a simple breakfast of porridge sweetened with preserved berries. "They thought my story would be a warning to others." The mountain man nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Instead," he replied, passing her a steaming cup of herbal tea, "you've written a beginning, not just for yourself, but for everyone who finds their way here." Mara sipped the warm liquid, feeling her baby shift beneath her heart. She had reclaimed her narrative, transforming abandonment into independence, rejection into chosen family. The first light of dawn painted the frost-covered windows with golden hues as Mara Silva's labor pains intensified. Outside, winter had wrapped the cabin in a pristine blanket of snow, but inside, warmth radiated from the crackling fire and the circle of support that had gathered around her. Joao Costa moved with calm efficiency, his broad shoulders relaxed despite the tension in the air. He had prepared for this moment for months, collecting herbs for pain and healing, boiling water, and arranging clean cloths. His weathered hands, usually busy with survival tasks, now offered steady support as Mara gripped them through each contraction. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured, the same words he'd spoken when he'd found her near death months ago. 3 young women, whom Mara had welcomed to their sanctuary, stood nearby. Paula Oliveira, once her harshest critic from the village, now watched with reverent attention, having arrived weeks earlier after her own family conflicts. The transformation in their relationship reflected Mara's journey itself, from rejection to reconciliation, from weakness to power. As morning stretched into afternoon, Mara's cries echoed through the cabin. The pain seemed endless, her body fighting against itself until finally, with one tremendous push and a primal scream that seemed to shake the mountain itself, her daughter entered the world. The first cry, strong and defiant, filled the room. Tears streamed down Mara's face as Joao placed the tiny, perfect child against her chest. The infant's skin was flushed pink, her tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight whatever challenges life might bring. "Clara," Mara whispered, her voice hoarse but certain. "Her name is Clara." Joao nodded, understanding immediately. Clara, light, the perfect name for the child born of darkness yet destined for brightness. The name honored not just the literal light that had guided Mara through the forest that first terrible night, but the metaphorical illumination she had found within herself. As the women helped clean and swaddle the newborn, Mara caught Joanne's gaze across the room. No words were needed between them. The mountain man who had once been a stranger was now family, the first person who had seen value in her when everyone else saw shame. Outside, the winter sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow. Inside the cabin, Clara's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb, a new grip on life, a new chapter beginning. Mara kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering promises of strength and love. The scars of her past remained, but they had healed into something beautiful, a map of survival that she would one day share with her daughter, teaching her that even the deepest wounds could become the source of greatest hope. Years passed, and the story of Mara Silva transformed from whispered gossip to cherished legend throughout the valleys of rural Brazil. Mothers in São Pedro de Vale now told their daughters about the young girl who had been cast out, pregnant and alone, only to forge a new life in the wilderness. Her tale became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even when family failed, courage could build something new from the ashes of rejection. The cabin that once stood as João Costa's solitary refuge had grown into something more. Additional shelters dotted the clearing, each built with the same careful craftsmanship the mountain man had taught his first apprentice. Women came from villages near and far, some fleeing circumstances like Mara's, others simply seeking the wisdom that flowed from this unexpected sanctuary. Clara, now a spirited young girl with her mother's determined eyes, raced through the gardens that had expanded across the forest edge. She knew every plant by name, every medicinal herb by scent, knowledge passed down from the tall, quiet man she called grandfather. João watched over her with the same protective care he had once shown her mother, his weathered face softening whenever she called his name. The village elders, including Roberto Santos, had eventually made their peace with the community that flourished beyond their control. What began as scandal had evolved into grudging respect, then genuine admiration. Twice yearly, traders from São Pedro would make the journey up the mountain paths, exchanging goods and stories with the women who had once been outcasts. Even Paula Oliveira, who had once hurled insults at Mara, now sent her own daughter to learn survival skills from the woman she had once scorned. The transformation wasn't just in the mountains, but had rippled back through the valley, softening harsh judgments and challenging old prejudices. On winter evenings, Mara would sit by the fire, her once thin frame now strong and capable, and share her story with newcomers. She spoke of despair and redemption, of learning to fish and hunt, of finding dignity when the world had tried to strip it away. But most importantly, she spoke of João, the man who had seen value where others saw shame. "We build our own families," Mara would tell them, Clara nestled against her side. "We choose our own paths." And in the heart of the mountains, surrounded by the community she had helped create, Mara Silva continued to thrive, her dignity unshakable, her love unbreakable, her spirit forever free.